The Big Life, presented by BloombergQuint.
Hi, I'm Menaka Doshi and welcome to The Big Life. This podcast is a journey to understand leadership, the habits and traits of people who are unafraid to chase their dreams and make them real. People who know how to live the big life. Currently on this podcast, we're featuring The Victory Project, 6 Steps to Peak Potential. It's an insightful book authored by Saurabh Mukherjea and Anupam Gupta. Today we want to discuss collaboration with the two authors. Now, collaboration is one of the 3 C's featured in the book. The other 2 C's being clutter reduction and creativity and memory. The authors write that these 3 C's or these 3 desirable behaviors are a stepping stone to achievement. With that, let me welcome Saurabh and Anupam back to The Big Life. Guys, welcome to episode 2.
Thank you so much, Menka. Really happy to be here.
Thank you, Menka. Thank you for inviting us to the podcast.
Before we get to collaboration, which is the theme of today's podcast, I want to chat with both of you on the other 2 C's, clutter, memory, and creativity. Now, Saurabh, in the leaders that you've interacted with, are they all just so genius that they retain everything that's important? Or have you found that they're just better at organizing their minds and their time?
So I think it's a question that I think we pondered long and hard about as we spent 2 years writing the Victory Project. And I think in the context of football, it's asked, does David Beckham know the laws of physics before he curves the ball into the goal from 40 yards, 50 yards outside the goal? I think it's a little bit like that with many leaders. They have a sense of innate sense of what to prioritize, and they're decluttering, their clutter reduction comes from a very acute sense of where their priorities lie as business leaders. And the second thing that we've seen with many of the experts we interviewed for the book is very, very tightly structured routines, right? And I think there are several books written on routine, most notably Charles Duhigg's The Power of Habit. But it's relatively clear to us now that if you are able to build a routine which emphasizes your priorities and allocates your time as per priorities, that effectively becomes a automatic route to having a day which delivers the most return on your time invested. So whether great leaders read books like ours and figure it out, whether they do it through time and error, whether they do it through trial and error is a moot point. But it's relatively clear to us that very few leaders are able to have power-packed days without a sense of prioritization and clutter reduction and without a well-structured.
If I can just follow up to that, Saurabh, a quick, tiny follow-up question, and that is that have you noticed differences in the way leaders organize their minds and time across generations? Because it is the younger generation that has had to deal with more clutter in their lives.
So it's interesting, Menaka. I think there's a broad, widespread perception that we are in some VUCA world and the world has become faster and all of that. It's not clear to us that is the case. What is clear, however, as you said, is the ubiquity of social media, the proliferation of social media has clearly cluttered brains, right? And the sort of the easy access all of us now have to the every shred of news in the world and notifications banging into our inbox and our Twitter accounts, that clearly has cluttered brains. So ironically, this whole perception of volatility, this perception of activity is probably more damaging than the actual reality in which you and I conduct our business lives. And at the sort of receiving end of this sort of perception is the iPhone generation. And you spent a fair bit of time in the book explaining how experts like Cal Newport have laid out quite effective routines to reduce the sort of toxification, reduce the clutter that social media has injected into our lives.
Okay, there's a lot more on clutter in the book, I know, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next C, which is creativity. And Anupam, I think one of the things we don't discuss enough in this country is risk-taking ability, right? For instance, there is an inherent risk in being creative, in being innovative. And whilst at one end, we've always been an entrepreneurial country, for some reason, we're not known to be big risk takers, at least when it comes to enterprise size. Is that because failure is so taboo?
Here's the thing. Failure is tough on anybody anywhere in the world. I think cultures might differ from country to country in how they treat failure, but as this very famous saying goes, that success isn't permanent and failure isn't fatal. So taking risks, entrepreneurship, and failure, they just, we think that they're part of life. There are two stories from our book that kind of resonate with me that I think might answer your question. The one was when we had gone to meet Sanjeev Bikhchandani in his house in Delhi, and he gave us like almost 2 hours, and it was such a wonderful experience. So, he's taken all kinds of maverick decisions. So we asked him about one of this, that why did you give up an MNC job to chase a startup? And we're talking about probably the 80s or the 90s or somewhere really early on, where entrepreneurship, risk taking, and all that wasn't as widely known or widely accepted as it is today, with this entire culture of startups. So he just very calmly attributed it to ego of all the things. Here's what he said. He said it's about persistence and sheer stubbornness, because I refuse to go back to a job branded as a failed entrepreneur. So he said that if you're struggling, no matter how long you struggle, you're simply not successful yet. You're not a failure. You're just not a success yet. The moment you quit entrepreneurship and go back to a job, you're declared a failure. You have nothing. You have no victory to declare. And he couldn't stomach being branded a failure. So I think a lot of this also matters in our internal makeups and how we deal with failure, because there are plenty of examples out there of people, entrepreneurs, sportsmen, Bollywood, movies have been given a second chance. So in the chapter on creativity, there's this great TED talk that was given by psychologist Adam Grant, on things that set original thinkers apart. There's a list of them. That the one that he mentions is fear of not trying, right? Because all of us feel fear, whether it's this society, this culture, that culture, everyone feels fear. But what sets original thinkers apart is not the fear of failure, actually, but the fear to try. So if you're, not trying, so trying and failing then opens up a new area of learning and improving, but not trying at all itself prevents one from even learning. I think that's what I would say.
And both those anecdotes are incredible, right? I think what Sanjeev says about continuously trying and hence never then having, the labels are so important for so many of us. So that's being one important thing. And the second is, I think we see that in the younger generation, the fear of not trying, the fear of, hey, what if I don't do that? Will my life amount to less? Which is maybe a generational thing. I'll come to collaboration, which is the core of today's conversation. There are 3 very interesting examples in the book. These are corporate examples: HDFC Bank, Amul, and TCS. Saurabh, why did you all think that these 3 companies exemplify the collaboration attitude?
So I think, Menka, if you ask me, the big learning I took away from writing the Victory Project was this aspect, the collaboration aspect, because until we started working on the book, like many other people, I had seen corporate history and corporate success through the prism of the individual, right? So even including my own book, Unusual Billionaires, I'd written about, say, HDFC Bank as something that Aditya Puri had constructed and created, Marico as a great company that Harsh Mariwala Saab had created, so on and so forth, right? And this is typically the way corporate histories are narrated, through the prism of a great man or a great woman, right? As we dug deeper into the sort of the higher levels of the victory paradigms, the more complicated, the more richer layers of the victory paradigm, we realized that outsized success, whether it be in corporate life or in fund management or indeed in the world of media or sport, outsized success necessarily involves the individual subsuming her identity in that of a broader whole. The broader whole could be a company, but it could be a cooperative housing society, it could be a state, it could be a nation. But if an individual says, I stand by myself and I'm not going to subsume my identity in a broader whole, outsized success becomes very elusive. And that's where we realize that case studies like Amul, right? If you ask most Indians about Amul, it's a household name. Most people haven't heard of Verghese Kurian. At least the average Amul consumer would have no idea who Verghese Kurian is. And I'm sure the great man would have liked it like that. He was instrumental in orchestrating this incredibly complex and rich cooperative institution, which is 3 times the size of Nestle India, but whose leadership, whose CEOs, whose founder, most people in India are oblivious to. And then once we understood that cooperation can be a very rich driver of success, we then looked at TCS through a different lens. And we asked around our colleagues who also work in the stock market. Very few people can name the first 3 CEOs of TCS. TCS is the world's largest IT services company now. It's had, I think, 5 CEOs in 50 years. Incredible powerhouse company. But most of these CEOs have been great servants to the company rather than people who have sought stardom. And then once you start seeing corporate history through the lens of the collective, rather than the individual, you start realizing that culture, cooperation, collaboration are actually very powerful drivers of corporate success.
You often look at these from an investment point of view as well. And I have just got one, additional question on this point to put to you. And which is that, we see that even in companies that exemplify teamwork, right? You talk about HDFC Bank. I'm sure that's the case with Apple as well. It couldn't have become such a big brand without that. But in some of these companies, the leader is the star, celebrity, through which the company is recognized. For instance, the next in line at HDFC Bank was not a well-known name necessarily, right?
Sure.
But in others, like TCS, where you've pointed out, the company is the brand, the team is the brand, and very few people will probably, identify the company with only one personality. Maybe Mr. Kohli as the founder, but beyond that, not necessarily. Is there one way that is more effective, one model that is more effective, where the team or the company is the star and not necessarily an individual?
So I think the way we've seen this in the context of investing is succession planning. If the promoter, the CEO, is the star, right, and he's the guy around whom the company's brand hinges and he's the rainmaker, then obviously I, as an investor, I'm faced with a challenge because everybody is mortal, and when the star goes away, I am left holding the can as an investor. So increasingly in our investment process in Marcellus, we have tried to look for companies where the succession planning itself is thought through over 5-10 years. Not just the CEO, but even the CFO, the head of HR, the head of technology is groomed, is trained over 4, 5, 6 years. And typically with such companies where training, where grooming the next generation is part and parcel of day-to-day life, typically in such companies, you won't find the star culture looming large, right? And I think the best example of this in India, I believe, is actually Asian Paints. This company has been listed for 40 years. Pretty much every 3-4 years, they've doubled their market cap. They have 55% market share in the paint sector. Every single Asian Paint CEO has been groomed, typically from the IIMs, trained and groomed internally over 20-30 years, elevated to CEO. The third generation of promoters are at the helm today. The CEO, there have been, I think, every 5-6 years, they have a new CEO. It makes no difference to the company's corporate performance. The stock market doesn't lose sleep. Who's the new CEO? Who was the prior CEO? They don't lose sleep if the promoter succession changes. That is what a class company should be. And I think increasingly what companies like TCS, Asian Paints, and hopefully over the next few years, HDFC Bank are showing the rest of the promoter communities build corporate cultures, build systems and processes which breed excellence over several generations, rather than building vehicles for outsized egos.
That's so true. We're so over the era of Jack Welch, aren't we? Well, anyways, gentlemen, one of the points you discuss in the book, a team of rivals, resonated with me. And I'm glad the man who discussed it is with you today. Manish Sabharwal is joining this podcast. Anupam, for that, I'm going to hand it over to you. Welcome, Manish.
Yeah, I mean, collaboration is an especially important step, and Manish really gave us a completely different perspective on that. I mean, you can specialize, simplify, meditate as much as you want, and all of that is great probably for developing internally. But no matter how creative you are, if you want to charge the world with your ideas, you need to learn how to influence other people and win their support and collaboration in favor of your cause. And one person who actually exemplifies this idea of collaboration, who's part of the book and joins us today, is Manish Sabharwal, co-founder and chairman of TeamLease. But it's what Manish does beyond TeamLease that is completely fascinating. He has so many roles which reflect his innate ability to collaborate with people from different background, right? So Manish is an independent member on the board of the Reserve Bank of India. He is a member on the National Skill Mission. And he's also a member of the advisory board of the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. And Manish also serves on various state and central government committees on education, employment, and employability. So Manish, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Anupam.
So Manish, let's start with this central idea of a team of rivals that Menka mentioned, that you also spoke to us at length back when we were at a wonderful house. How do you think this fits in a corporate culture where leaders like to be surrounded by like-minded people? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that as you get older, the one thing you realize is the most dangerous lies are the lies you tell yourself. I think the earlier in life that you realize that, the better it is for you. And I think for me, Team of Rivals, written by Doris Goodwin, which really showed how the 5 people who stood against the elections for Lincoln, he hired them in his cabinet, and how they didn't like him in the first 1 or 2 years were not exactly great with them in the cabinet because they obviously were rivals, but how they became a team. For somebody like me who's an entrepreneur, but who recognizes that my CEO role is different from my board member role, which is different from my shareholder role. And in fact, sometimes I think they're in real tension in my cerebral cortex, right? One of the things I've been thinking about a lot during the lockdown is a quote by Jonas Salks. He's the inventor of the polio vaccine. He said, the most important question to ask yourself is, are you being a good ancestor? And, what he's essentially saying is, are you balancing the next quarter and next quarter century? And so the only way you can really do that is with cognitive diversity around you. I mean, you guys work in financial markets. You know that the only free ride in markets is diversification, right? I mean, the only way to reduce your risk and increase your returns is diversification. But I would submit that's actually a profound insight even for running an effective board, for building a company. There are 2 kinds of companies you can build, a baby and a dwarf. Both are small, but the baby is going to grow. All the, dwarfs I've studied lacked cognitive diversity, lacked a team of rivals, lacked a culture of honesty. And they told themselves lies, and the most dangerous ones are the ones you tell yourself. So I would submit that how do you reconcile team of rivals? Actually, you don't need to reconcile. People who don't recognize that cognitive diversity in a team of rivals is the only way to go, their companies will be small, their lives will be small, and maybe in the end, they won't get to where they want to go. So there's a great children's book. My wife runs a school, and it's called Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Doors. You have to have mirrors around you, which become windows which you look out of, and then you walk through the door. So I'd say we can talk about this later on, how to organize yourself for sort of honesty or for being called out or, cognitive diversity. But without cognitive diversity, I don't think anything big gets done.
Fantastic. So Manish, I remember how you quoted the Renaissance physician Paracelsus and how the dose makes the poison and how balance really matters. Saurabh, your thoughts, because you're someone who has in the last, I would say, 10 to 12 years, built teams 2 times, once in your previous job and once at your, and one that you're doing right now. What are your thoughts on this?
So look, whilst I've built teams a couple of times in the last 10 years, I'm hoping I don't have to do it again in the next 10 years. I think after meeting Manish, right, and I remember you and I spoke after the meeting, and I remember sitting in a coffee shop with you a week later discussing it. I think what we really benefited from was that perspective he gave us on collaboration. When we then wedded that with what Gurcharan Das had told us when we met him about the Marwadi community in India. And he gave us this wonderful book by Thomas Timberg on the Marwadis from, I think the book was called Marwadis from Jagat Seth to Birla. And what's so interesting about the Marwadi community is it's an example of collaboration without a leader. Right. And as many people probably know, there's around 9 million Marwadis in the country, but they're clearly the most outsized example of business success anywhere in our country. And yet this incredibly collaborative community doesn't have a leader. And it's only when I read the Thomas Timberg book, I realized that the ethos of collaboration that permeates Marwadi life is only possible because there isn't an all-powerful, omnipotent leader giving directions and instructions on who's supposed to help whom on what terms. And if you apply that in the context of corporate life, it's suddenly makes a lot of sense as to why companies like Amul or Asian Paints or an HDFC Bank, or in the context of say the not-for-profit sector, how successful not-for-profits are able to have outsized impact. It's when you take ego out of the equation that you allow diversity to come in. As long as there is an omnipotent leader who lays down the law, it's very difficult to build diverse institutions. If you don't build diverse institutions, as Manish so nicely explained, you're setting yourself up for failure. And then you dial the knob in the completely the opposite direction. You take the leader out of the equation altogether, and you end up with incredibly successful communities like the Marwadis in our country, or say the Jews and the Jewish community in the United States, right? And I think the real world out there, we don't need to sort of go to business school to learn these lessons. The real world out there is teaching investors like myself that look for companies where the leader, the CEO, the promoter does not lay down the law, does not dictate terms to everybody else. Look for collaborative enterprises, because they are the enterprises that will succeed in a highly competitive free market economy.
Sure. So, Manish, coming back to you, just taking this discussion on diversity and balance one step further. I remember how you told us about Hoysala architecture and temples in Vellore in Karnataka, which featured three animals, and to show how kings balance these three animals. The first being lions. Lions stood for power. Second being elephants. Elephants stood for strength. And third being horses. Horses standing for speed. And you showed how this balance works so well at TeamLease with you and Ashok. Why do you think this balance is important? And I'm asking you also this because, there is this hero worship and cult. We tend to associate success with one person, whereas obviously it's much deeper than that. So tell us, why do you think this balance is important?
I mean, our board member said something very cool in one of our board meetings. He said, if only Manish had been around, the company wouldn't have survived. And if only Ashok had been around, the company would have been 1,000th of its size. I think we both agree. I've never met an acquisition I don't want to make. Ashok's never met an acquisition he wants to make. I'm good at marketing. He's good at operations. I make our employees cry. He has therapy sessions with cribbing employees. I mean, he's ugly. I'm good looking. I could go on. But the point here is that I think that we have benefited by protecting each other from himself. Right. So I think that as we sort of think about our own sort of transition from a founder managed to a founder led to a founder governed company, we want a board that protects us from ourselves and helps us make this transition. Right. So I think that the balance, whether you view it as characteristics, whether you view it as balance between the next quarter and next quarter century, and view the balance between extremes. One of the most interesting books during the lockdown was the biography of Dadabhai Naoroji by Dinyar Patel. And the most wonderful line in that is that it says Dadabhai Naoroji was successful because he was too moderate for the radicals and too radical for the moderates. To me, that sort of, it would be an aspirational statement, right? If you want to get reforms done in India, we just got labor reforms done in India. The radicals didn't get what they wanted, nor did the moderates get what they wanted, but we got something done. So I would submit that I think the difference between a baby and a dwarf as an entrepreneur, the difference between a reform that gets talked about and actually gets done, or any change that you see in the world is done by a team of people who respected each other rather than liked each other. And I'll come back to this like point later as we sort of think about what we can do in our daily lives. But I would say that, the balance is something that you go out and seek because it's not a natural condition of any group or any institution.
Sure. Thanks, Manish. Saurabh, you just finished this trilogy, starting with Unusual Billionaires, Copycat, Investing, and now the Victory Project. And throughout, you would have met tons and tons of promoters across the spectrum, right? From, like Manish said, founder managed, founder led, founder governed. And you would have probably met across the spectrum all these kinds of people. So what's your views on this balance, on this diversity, and the team of rivals from the promoters that you have met, the companies that you have met, and the culture that's there in India? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think we've got to be fair to our business leaders in that 20 years ago, our country probably wasn't at a juncture where you could go out into the market and create a brand without the promoter, right? 20 years ago, we were still a country with per capita income, I guess, of $400, right? And our institutions simply weren't evolved enough for HDFC Bank to create a brand around just the branches and the logo. Right now, as a country's financial institutions become more trusted, as its legal institutions become more reliable, as a country matures, it becomes easier for promoters, for founders, to create balanced institutions where it's not one persona which is driving the firm. There isn't one persona which is fronting the company in the context of the public. Instead, it's an institution which is being presented to the public, right? And I think we've seen that transition. So if you sort of see Marico, as I've described in Unusual Billionaires, the first 20-25 years of Marico, for all intents and purposes, was Harsh Mariwala and his extended family, which at that point owned the Marico business that was part of the Bombay oil business. It's through the last 10-15 years that Marico has become institutionalized. They have an MD and a CEO who's a professional, high quality IIT IIM recruit who's grown in the firm. Similarly, it is I think appropriate that we're having this discussion in the month Aditya Puri is stepping down. I don't think without Aditya Puri being there, HDFC Bank would have had the first 5-10 years that it did, where they became really the first private sector bank in India to make a mark, to build a highly profitable banking business, right? And it's appropriate that he hands over the baton this month to Sashi with a $100 billion market cap, with a bank which is legendary for systems and processes. It's called the Standard Operating Processes Bank. So I think the evolution of the Indian economy, the maturity of the Indian state has allowed the creation of these more balanced institutions, rather than institutions where the promoter lays down the law and everybody basically has to jump when the promoter cracks the whip.
Okay, so we are wrapping up this episode. Manish, in both the previous questions, you said that you'll come back to these points later. So I'm going to ask you about that if you can, two things. One, like we spoke in the first question that we had asked, can collaboration be taught? And second is, how do we go about learning it? Both are associated questions. Both of them, kind of are a summary and a distillation of the first two answers that you gave. So can you just wrap this up for us? Whether it's an advice on collaboration or what are your thoughts on taking collaboration forward? Should it be taught, and how one can learn it?
I mean, you can try and learn it, but I would sort of, there's a wonderful scene in a movie called Two Popes, where the conservative Pope calls the young Pope and sends him that all change is compromise, but I need a spiritual hearing aid. For me, that's stuck in my head. Everybody needs some kind of hearing aid. So, of course, you can bet on learning, but I think that, betting on hearing aids, one is know thyself, be clear about your ambition. Not everybody wants to build a 10,000 crore company. It takes a lot of heartache, a lot of work. So first of all, if you're clear about your ambition, then reconcile your methods. As a corporate, maybe dilute your equity, right? I only have 18% of my company. I have to listen to everybody, right? Because I don't have majority. So I really can't be the Ayatollah who owns 51 or 75% of my company. So I think I have, 5 foreign investors own, twice of me in Ashok. So I think that it's clear that I have to listen to them. I think the most important one is, drop like as a standard. See, I remember, over the last few years, we've got a lot of senior people, and one of my talented, loyal colleagues came to me. I don't want to work with this guy. I don't like him. And I said, well, I've been working with you for 20 years. I don't like you, right? Like is not a standard for working together. So I would submit that, this whole concept of surrounding yourself with cognitive diversity, it's not with people who don't hang out with people who went to the same school as you, who have the same gender as you, seek out. For me, the biggest learning or the best classroom of the last 5-10 years has been RBI board meetings. I mean, obviously, we've had a lot of drama in the last 5 years. That has added to the pleasure of learning. But I'd say that it is a world which I did not inhabit. The surface area of my mind has increased. I realized that life is not the solving of a sum, it is the painting of a picture. And as chairman, I would have never had that. And the last point which I'll make is, put yourself in places where you don't have hard power, right? For example, on the RBI board meeting, I only have soft power, which is the power of my ideas, the power of my analysis. In my own company, as chairman, I'm an ayatollah. I can issue fatwas and things get done, right? So put yourself in circumstances where you don't have hard power, but you sort of have to exercise your soft power, and that will lead to you developing those muscles of listening, which by definition, the first stage of balance is listening.
Saurabh, your thoughts?
So I think, listening to Manish is such a privilege that every time I listen to him, I learn. And listening to him today reminded me of something I had thought of when we met in his house, and something I thought of as we finished the book, which is that the opposite of collaboration isn't selfishness, isn't the opposite of collaboration isn't the autocratic leader. The opposite of collaboration, right? Remember, collaboration is about subsuming your ego and saying that there's a better way, there's a different way of doing this. If I work with other people who have other skills, other perspectives that I don't have. So the opposite of collaboration is the use of everything that we hear and see around us, to use that to fuel our ego. And what social media, I think, has done is made it very difficult for individuals to take their own perspectives of the world, right? And in a paradoxical way, social media superficially looks like it encourages collaboration. But what social media seems to do more than encourage collaboration, that's the superficial level, is encouraging collaboration. Social media is allowing people to believe they can amplify their thoughts. It's giving people a megaphone to tell the world what they think on such and such matter, rather than actually becoming collaborators, right? And therefore, the clutter reduction piece of the simplicity paradigm isn't just a question of practicality. You're not just reducing clutter because it will free up time to do other useful things. The clutter reduction part is also important in that if you keep using social media to amplify and use it as a megaphone for your thoughts, you're amplifying your ego. You're making it much harder for yourself to work in collaborative relationships. And that dichotomy hit me very hard when we sat in Manish's living room in his library, and then as we were finishing the book. So the opposite of collaboration isn't being selfish. The opposite of collaboration is you're feeding the hosepipe of social media into your brain and letting it comprehensively clutter your head and amplify your ego.
Wonderful. And on that very positive note, this is a wrap on this episode of The Big Life. A big thank you to Manish Sabharwal, co-founder and chairman of TeamLease, and Saurabh Mukherjea, co-founder CIO at Marcellus. Manish, Saurabh, thank you so much for joining us.